By 1900, Emperor Menelik and his wife Taitu owned 70,000 slaves. Please look at Richard Pankhurst's Economic History of Ethiopia, 1800 to 1935, page 75. I have been teaching world history for over 3 decades, which includes early slavery in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. Most of you probably may not know slavery existed in Europe for 1,000 years. And later on in the Atlantic world, I have not seen, I don't claim I have seen every book, but I have not seen a single individual who owned as many as 70,000 slaves just in 1900. Why do I emphasize this? It is this emperor Abiy Ahimad glorifies, and he becomes his role model. And the system they want to restore is really that version, basically. Menelik created a highly centralized state that recognized a single identity, a single language, a single culture, a single religion.
Slavery was very common in Ethiopia. Human beings were bought and sold like cattle in open markets. The two particular enslaved nations were the Oromo and the Gumuz. They were respectively classified as light-skinned Gala slave and dark-skinned Shankila slave. Someone who wants to marry a daughter of a wealthy family was asked by the bridegroom's parents to provide a guarantee that they would purchase light-skinned Gala slave and dark-skinned Shankila slaves for the bride. One had to show that they can provide a light-skinned Gala slave and dark-skinned Shankila slave before he is allowed to marry the bride. When the bridegroom-to-be's family visits the bride-to-be's family to ask for a hand in marriage, the first question that they asked was whether they could afford to buy a slave for her. Can you buy a light-skinned Gala slave and dark-skinned Shankila slave? The bride's family would ask. The family of the bridegroom often agrees to this. Those are the terms. They buy a light-skinned Gala slave and a black-skinned Shankila slave and take the girl. These slaves would serve the bride all her life. This is why the slave trade flourished in Ethiopia.
How widespread was this practice?
Wow, I saw this practice myself. I grew up witnessing it firsthand. This was the culture I was brought up in. Today, when I remember our history of that era, I feel sick to my bones. They were treated very cruelly. There were female and male slaves. The female slave ground grain. The men shouldered all the farming duties. Regardless, they were beaten up by their owner for no apparent reason. Otherwise, the owner would be considered weak by his neighbors.
Why do they beat them up?
They tied them up and beat them up for no reason. That was the rule of the day. The slaves performed their obligations without fail. It would be understandable if they refused to perform their duties. She ground grain, she cooked for the family, and yet she got beaten up in public regularly. It was like a ritual. The beating day would be scheduled and announced. Villagers would gather to watch. We would all go, sit back and watch. Once the villagers gathered, they walked the slave to the beating place. It's not because she was disloyal or refused to work. It is done simply because that was the law. Villagers admired the slave owner who was good at battering his slaves. They would speak of him with admiration. Have you seen how good he was at beating up his slaves? I am an eyewitness to this. I lived long to see that. I am 90 years old. I can attest to this state of Ethiopian history.
Where were these slaves brought from?
From the Oromo land. These are the same Oromos who have gained their freedom today. The slave traders used to go to the Oromo country, kidnap and bring them here.
You mean by force? They brought them by force?
Yes, by force, after kidnapping them.
Who are the Shankilas?
The Shankilas are brought from the west bordering Sudan. Now they travel through Kwara and via a place called Imilbul. Now they are known as Gumuz and Benishangul people. Dark-skinned Shankila slaves used to come from there. Light-skinned Gala slaves used to come from Oromo land. Those Oromo girls were 10 times more beautiful than those ugly ladies whom they were forced to serve as slaves because of their powerful relationship. Once they kidnapped a breastfeeding woman with her infant baby. When they were walking with them during the night, the baby made a noise. The kidnappers took the baby from the back of the mother and threw her in the river. They did so for fear that her cry might alert the villagers and they would be caught. On another occasion, when another kidnapped child cried out of fear, they slashed her throat and threw her into a ravine for fear of being caught. A breastfeeding mother whose milk was flowing out was caught during one of these raids. They slapped her continuously and beat her up brutally with the butt of a gun on their way to their destination. They put a metal cuff with thorny edges on her legs, which tore deep into her flesh. It was literally impossible to walk in that cuff. She would be ordered to get up and walk, but she would stumble and fall. The captors would beat her up for falling down. She would stand up to walk and would fall again. The beating continues. The cuff was too tight and cut deep into her flesh. They often announced slave whipping events to villagers. When it happens, their hands and legs were stretched apart and tied with ropes. The slave would receive 40 whips at a time. The whipping commonly ripped off skin from the slave's back. The slaves would scream due to pain inflicted on them by the owner. They would beg for mercy. No one would intervene to stop the beating. The villagers enjoyed the spectacle. They would laugh and entertain themselves with no concern for the slave's suffering. For them, it was like a wedding celebration. They sang. For the tortured person, that practice was painful like hell. When they prepared them for sale on the slave market, the slave owners disfigured the slaves to a subhuman level. Because of the slave's normally straight and beautiful hair, the owner was afraid that a would-be buyer would mistake the slave for a free person and would not make the purchase. Consequently, they cut the slave's hair in quite a disorderly manner, an ugly way, in an effort to convince the would-be slave buyer that their slave is a real slave and not a free person. This is how they sold them. They would also pierce the slave's tongue with a thorn to the extent that the slave would be unable to speak properly. When they are unable to speak, then that is used as another evidence that they are good slaves. If the slave is able to speak Amharic, no one would make the purchase because the slave would be considered a free person. This is how people are bought and sold like cattle in Ethiopia.